After reading this module, you should be able to know more about stated preference methods, particularly the use of contingent valuation in economic valuation of environmental resources. Learn how to construct hypothetical markets in order to obtain the responses for the purpose of valuation. Identify the ways of interpreting responses obtained through CVM in order to arrive at results that can be directly used to solve the problem in hand. Evaluate the responses by applying appropriate econometric techniques and analyze the applicability of contingent valuation method.
Economists tend to think that markets work well most of the time. When it is said that markets work well, it means that they efficiently allocate resources. When markets allocate resources efficiently, thereby suggesting no state intervention required, resources are generally employed in those uses where the marginal benefits are equal to the marginal costs. However, when markets fail to allocate resources efficiently, government intervention shall be sought. Absence of markets or failure of markets for certain goods like environmental goods lead to problems in valuation as well. Valuation of environmental goods has assumed paramount importance in current scenario of persistent degradation of environment. The problem in estimating the economic value of environmental goods stem from the fact that they are not routinely traded in market and the economic data on their prices, which is indicative of their value, is not generally available. There are two basic approaches to value environmental goods. First approach involves inferring economic value by observing consumers' behavior towards the good, which are traded in the market and have close connection to the environmental good, being valued, for example, packaged drinking water. This can be viewed as an indirect approach in which the environmental good enters as an input in the production of the traded good. Alternatively, environmental goods can be directly valued if the consumers are given opportunity to make a choice regarding the environmental good itself. Now, this direct approach can be further classified into stated preference method and revealed preference method.
Stated preference methods obtain estimates of willingness to pay WTP and willingness to accept compensation WTA amounts for a given environmental change from individuals through a constructed questionnaire, for example, contingent valuation method. Revealed preference method, on the other hand, infers WTP and WTA estimates on examining individuals' behavior in markets that are related to the environmental good. For example, travel cost method and hedonic pricing. Stated preference methods are implemented with hypothetical questions about future behavior.
The CVM is a stated preference valuation method that asks willingness to pay or willingness to accept compensation or voting questions that directly estimate non-market benefits. The contingent valuation method is called contingent valuation because it uses information on how people say they would behave given certain hypothetical situations contingent on being in the real situation. Other stated preference methods are contingent behavior and conjoint analysis. Contingent behavior uses hypothetical recreation trips to implement the travel cost method, hypothetical location decisions to implement the hedonic price method, or hypothetical purchases of market goods to implement the averting behavior method. However, conjoint analysis is an approach where respondents are asked multiple questions about, for example, where they would take a recreation trip and which house or drug treatment they would purchase.
The absence of direct information on the price and quantity for environmental goods generates the need for a proxy pricing mechanism for such goods. Literature provides two different concepts in this context: willingness to pay WTP and willingness to accept compensation WTA. WTP refers to what a person would pay for a particular environmental good, whereas WTA indicates the amount a person would accept as compensation for a little less of environmental good. Apart from these concepts, marginal willingness to pay, MWTP, or marginal willingness to accept compensation, MWTA, are the corresponding concepts used to arrive at the demand curve for the environmental good. For an economic good which has a direct pricing mechanism, MWTP and MWTA might be nearly equal. For example, person A demands 25 liters of gasoline when the price is $1 per liter. So $1 is the price A is willing to pay for a marginal unit of gasoline. Alternatively, if A is asked for the price that she would accept as compensation to forego 1 liter of gasoline, thereby reducing her consumption to 24 liters, her answer would be roughly $1. Hence, A's MWTP for 1 more liter of gasoline is approximately equal to her MWTA. In contrast, for an environmental good like clean air, MWTA might not equal MWTP. If the respondent is asked for the amount he is willing to pay to access a marginal unit of clean air, his valuation is usually bounded by the income he or she earns or other socioeconomic constraints. However, the willingness to accept compensation is rarely seen to be affected in such a manner. For a public good with no good substitutes, willingness to accept usually exceeds willingness to pay because willingness to accept is not income constrained. For a private good for which there are good substitutes, willingness to accept and willingness to pay will not be very different.
Although the divergence between willingness to accept compensation and willingness to pay can be theoretically understood, but in application, the willingness to accept questions can be problematic. Willingness to accept questions often generate a large number of values that are not income constrained or with properties that do not conform to consumer theory. Primarily out of convenience, willingness to pay questions have been used when willingness to accept questions is theoretically more appropriate.
The contingent valuation method CVM was first used by Davis in a study of hunters in Maine in 1963. CVM primarily has been extensively used by environmental economists in order to value goods with both use values, direct utility, and non-use values, also known as passive existence or preservation values, which refer to the values associated with the preservation or improvement of natural resources. The basis for the economic valuation of a change in prices or the availability of a good is to inquire what is the most an individual is willing to pay, WTP, for that change, if it is desirable, or the minimum compensation that they are willing to accept, WTA, to forego the change. Contingent valuation does just this. It asks people what they are WTP for an improvement in environmental quality or what they are WTA to go without this improvement.
The advantages of CVM, that is the contingent valuation method, and other stated preference methods can be precisely understood in comparison with revealed preference methods. It has been argued that stated preference methods like CVM are more flexible and can be used to accurately estimate benefits beyond the range of experience. In addition to the flexibility, CVM can be used to estimate value of goods with no use values, as WTP in this case is not dependent on any prospect of direct use of the resource being valued. Estimation of value through CVM is better suited for the goods with non-use values because they do not motivate the behavior of people, and hence behavioral methods cannot be used to ascertain such values. For example, willingness to pay for improved water quality of a severely polluted lake cannot be possibly estimated with behavioral methods because the lake may not have been directly used in the past. For policies and projects that involve significant uncertainty, as many do, the appropriate measure of the impacts for policies and projects that involve significant uncertainty, as many do, the appropriate measure of the impacts of policy is an ex-ante measure. CVM is better suited in this regard as the uncertainty might be theoretically and empirically modeled in CVM analysis. The respondents usually answer willingness to pay questions after taking into account or consideration all the uncertainties they are aware at the time of eliciting responses. Other revealed preference methods, which takes into consideration ex post measures of value in assigning probabilities to different outcomes, may induce great deal of uncertainty.
CVM is conducted through the following 5 stages: identification of the problem, setting up hypothetical markets and constructing questionnaires, obtaining bids, econometric and statistical methods to estimate WTP and analyze the factors that cause variations, and finally, validating the results against existing literature. Identification of the problem. Effective implementation of CBM to evaluate any environmental resource requires a thorough understanding of the causes of its depletion or degradation. It is only then can one identify the players in the hypothetical scenario to whom the questions of willingness to pay or willingness to accept compensation may be presented.
Any environmental problem can be roughly seen as interplay between the polluter and the victim. The issue of property right becomes useful in certain cases, for example, air pollution. It entails the notion of whether the polluter has the right to pollute or victim has the right to clean air. Comprehensive understanding of these factors help in appropriate construction of the hypothetical market.
Setting up hypothetical markets and constructing questionnaire. Generally, environmental goods are not traded in the market, and hence a hypothetical scenario is presented before the respondent where he or she is made to imagine that such a market exists. The description of the hypothetical market includes describing the policy that quantifies the environmental change to be achieved within a specified time period, identifying the people who would pay for the suggested environmental changes, specifying the amount and the payment or bid vehicle, and a status quo scenario if the policy is not implemented. A good questionnaire is absolutely important in CVM exercises. An ideal questionnaire shall include the comprehensive hypothetical scenario, WTP, WTA questions, and questions on socio-economic background of respondents.
For example, the respondents through a comprehensive questionnaire may be asked to value clean air, which they shall enjoy after effective implementation of the policy. This serves as the reason for payment. A bid vehicle needs to be introduced at this stage, which could be a form of taxation instrument used to generate funds. For example, increase in local income tax, local property tax, hike in parking fees, hike in fuel prices, etc. A good questionnaire is absolutely important in CVM exercises. An ideal questionnaire shall include the comprehensive hypothetical scenario, WTP or WTA questions, and the questions on socio-economic background of respondents. The questionnaire constructed is first floated around for pilot survey in order to assess its effectiveness. Upon receiving the responses of pilot survey, the researcher makes requisite changes, if any. The main survey is carried out after the pilot survey. One can obtain responses from the respondents chosen via an appropriate sampling methods through personal and face-to-face interviews or telephone interview, via the internet surveys or by mail surveys. Among all these survey methods, personal or face-to-face interviews facilitate detailed interviewing but are costly to execute. Telephone interviews too are costly and also less preferred because it becomes difficult to convey detailed information about the hypothetical scenario over telephone. Internet surveys are growing in popularity among academics, marketeers, and political officials. Marginal cost of data collection is quite low, and also data is easy to handle and sort. Mail surveys are frequently used but suffer from potential non-response bias and often from low response rates. Typically, a CVM survey will ask some general questions about environmental attitudes, test for the knowledge of good in question, and provide information on the hypothetical scenario. Collect WTP or W2A information, ask for social economic data on the respondent, and pose some debriefing questions such as how hard the respondent found the exercise.
Obtaining bids. The bids can be obtained from respondents in several ways. The respondents may be asked to state either their WTP or WTA or both. However, asking for WTP is simple and hence is estimated in most studies as a payment card. A range of values is presented on a card and the respondent is asked to pick the value which closely corresponds to their willingness to pay. As an open ended question, individuals are asked for their maximum WTP with no value being suggested to them. As a single bounded dichotomous choice, a single payment is suggested to which respondents either agree or disagree. As a double bounded dichotomous choice, those respondents who say no to the first amount are then asked if they would pay a lower amount, whilst those respondents who say yes to the first amount are asked if they would pay a higher amount. Econometric and statistical methods to estimate WTP and analyze the factors that cause variations. The need of statistical inference and econometric techniques is inevitable. In order to estimate WTP or WTA and establish statistical relationship between the probability of positive WTP and covariates such as household income, education, awareness, age, gender, prices offered as bids, protest responses are separated out. Protest responses are those responses that yield zero willingness to pay for all other reasons except the zero value being placed on the environmental good. In the cost benefit analysis, estimating mean willingness to pay and reporting its confidence interval is important. For payment card designs, mean WTP could be calculated from the maximum value that people say they are willing to pay. Methods of estimation of WTP primarily depend upon the pattern of responses obtained through CV survey. Well-behaved pattern of responses generate estimates of WTP that may not be very sensitive to the choice of distribution for unobserved random component or the form of preference function. But such well-behaved patterns are not always observed in responses. The sensitivity of WTP responses in CV study calls for a least restrictive approach to estimation set in non-parametric approach or distribution-free models. These models measure central tendency and dispersion of WTP based on a particular notion that a respondent's choice of yes to a contingent valuation question implies that WTP does not fall below the offered bid price. As willingness to pay is unobservable to the researcher, the Turnbull approach allows the researcher to consider WTP, say W, as a random variable with a particular cumulative distribution function, say FW, which can be seen as the probability that the willingness to pay is less than W. No responses are then analyzed, and this probability is assumed to be the same for different individuals offered the same price. Single bound dichotomous choice CV questions used in this survey asked the respondents to say yes or no to a fixed amount, say TJ. If they said yes, then it implied that their WTP is greater than or equal to TJ. Otherwise, it meant WTP is lesser than TJ. The probability that the respondent will say no to a price of TJ is then given by PR bracket WTPI is lesser than TJ bracket closed is equal to FW is equal to FJ. Econometric and statistical methods to estimate WTP and analyze the factors that cause variations. In order to calculate lower bound on mean WTP, the information on variation in the characteristics of sampled individuals and the prices offered is used. As mentioned in data collection framework, the sample in this study was chosen randomly and the prices offered in the CV question were also randomly assigned. For each price offered TJ, we call NJ as the number of people whose response to the offered price was no. TJ is the total number of people offered price TJ. So, FJ is equal to NJ oblique TJ gives sample proportion of no responses to the offered prices. When offered price increases in large samples, the proportion of no responses to each successive bid is expected to increase. That is, Fj is greater than or equal to Fj plus 1. A bid function is a regression equation which relates WTP to those variables thought likely to influence it. The intention is to see how much of the variation in WTP can be statistically explained and to see whether variables are related to WTP in an intuitively consistent manner. These methods directly model WTP function for dichotomous choice CV question. The interest in such binary response models arise primarily because the response probability is given by PR bracket y is equal to 1 oblique x close brackets is equal to PR bracket y is equal to 1 oblique x1 x2 xk close brackets where x denotes full set of explanatory variables, that is the covariates of respondents in this study, and y is willingness to pay indicator which takes value 1 if respondent's choice is yes to referendum question and 0 otherwise. Let us now estimate the model using simple ordinary least squares OLS. The coefficients on explanatory variables can take any value and may well not be in the correct range unless complex restrictions are imposed on it. It is quite possible to obtain slope coefficients on explanatory variables betas either less than 0 or greater than 1, which makes little sense in the context of probability. In binary response model, the main aim is to estimate the effects of xj on response probability. Probability of y is equal to 1 given x is equal to f bracket beta 0 plus beta 1 x1 plus beta 2 x2 and so on to beta k xk close brackets is equal to f xt beta, where xt beta is equal to beta 0 plus beta 1 x1 plus beta 2 x2 plus and so on to beta k xk, and f is a probability function that gives values between 0 and 1. Various nonlinear transformations have been suggested for the function f in order to make sure that the probabilities lie between 0 and 1. Probit and logit models are some suggested functions. Validating the results against existing literature. A bid function thus constructed may be estimated using appropriate econometric models. Various socioeconomic, demographic, and subjective characteristics of respondents influence the probability of positive willingness to pay in a contingent valuation study. There are a priori or theoretical expectations through which these characteristics may influence WTP. An example of WTP for clean air, household income, education, awareness, history of respiratory symptoms or air pollution related illnesses, and the number of children in the household are all expected to have a positive impact on the probability of affirmative willingness to pay. Age and price offered bid is expected to be inversely related to this probability.
Let us now summarize what we have learned in this module. First, CVM is an extensively used method for economic valuation of environmental goods with both use and preservation values. Second, it has been directly applied in many studies, for example, to value benefits of improved air quality, water quality, wildlife, and other elements of ecosystem. CVM primarily involves obtaining bids from respondents by setting up a hypothetical scenario. This bid function is then estimated with the use of appropriate statistical and econometric methods. There are various bottlenecks and challenges that affect the CVM study.
Certain important factors that the researcher must be careful about while adopting this approach to measure policy impacts for benefit cost analysis. These factors include the difference between hypothetical and actual behavior, problems of embedding, aggregating, and property rights. Hypothetical bias. CVM presents a hypothetical scenario to the respondents in order to obtain willingness to pay. In various experimental settings, the hypothetical willingness to pay figures is found to be overstated. In general, respondents tend to state their willingness to pay for an environmental good, but when faced with real purchase decisions, they are either reluctant to pay or actually pay less. Related government policies. There are very few government policies which are independent of any other governmental policies. Most of the policies are either complementary or substitutes of other policies, either at the same level of government or at different levels. These relationships complicate the application of the CVM and results in certain biases. Clarity over property rights. The willingness to pay question in the hypothetical scenario has to be carefully drafted in the context of vested property rights. Aggregation problems due to poor response rates. Relatively few contingent valuation surveys achieve a response rate sufficient for aggregation over the population without major adjustments.